If you live, work, or travel through Polk County, the 2018-2019 budget will affect you in many positive ways. The budget helps fund transportation planning and road repairs, parks programs and properties, healthcare programs, our emergency response services, and much more. Joining me today are Commissioner George Lindsey and Budget Director Todd Bond to tell us more about the budget process. Thank you for joining us, gentlemen.
We're glad to be here.
So let's dive right in. How long does the budget process take?
A lot longer than most people think. The board typically has their retreat in February of each year, and during that process, meeting with senior staff and the county manager and Todd and his team, we begin to set priorities for the coming year. In previous years, priorities have been water resources, others have been transportation. This year we focused on public safety and began to give special attention to public safety, where we are falling short, where the challenges are, and what are the limitations. So as we bring the retreat to closure, we set goals and priorities for the board and gives directions to the county staff to move forward. We have to go through this budget process and several public hearings, and it's quite involved in detail, so it takes a lot of planning. Todd's team does a great job, so that by the time we get to the end of the summer, the senior staff, the county manager, has put together a budget that reflects the wishes and priorities of the commission, and then begins to have those work sessions on each component of the budget so as to ensure that he has interpreted our messages correctly. And then by this time we have more dialogue among ourselves as commissioners as to indeed is the staff moving in the direction that we anticipated. Mm-hmm. And Mr. Freeman is great administrator in giving the board, the elected officials, the options as to which directions we might go, the consequences on results and the consequences on cost. And so that begins to bring things into focus. And so by the time we have our second hearing in September, which is statutorily required to have 2 public hearings. Our first hearing was a week ago, and we went through the process, took public input, took action then. That was the first of 2 readings. Then we'll have the follow-up adoption hearing, and again it'll be a public hearing process in which we'll hear from anyone who chooses to share their thoughts. And even at that late moment, that 11th hour of the day, the commission has the discretion with a majority vote to move dollars, to change programs, to shift focus. It would be unusual to do so, and it would be probably nibbling around the edges, but we want to hear from the public, and we've had some public input along the way, and so we hope that the budget process concludes, then that becomes effective for our roadmap for October 1, fiscal year for the county. And then next February, we'll start the process all over again.
Wow, wow. And so your department is working on this from February forward?
Yes. Yeah, we actually before that, because we start our planning for the budget process almost as soon as the fiscal year is over. So in October, November, we start planning, working with county management as to what we're going to present in the retreat and what items are important to bring up to the board at the retreat. And then as the commissioner said, we get guidance at the retreat, and then my staff really starts working through some of the detail with all the divisions in the county, kind of making sure what all the budgets are going to be for each of the divisions, putting that together through the spring time frame. And then in summer, we start with some workshops, work sessions with the board and decision making at that point.
Very good.
What I wanted to share with the audience is the fact that it's a lot of money that comes through this county. Our budget is $1.55 billion. That is huge. When we get our tax bill each year, at our homes or businesses, that is but a tiny, tiny fraction of the total budget. And Todd has put together a great slide that might begin to show where those dollars come from and where they go. If the slide represents, and I'm used slide because I'm an old guy and I'm still thinking about 35 millimeter slides way back when, and carousels. The But the visual shows the total budget of 1.55 billion. And then I'm going to let Todd go through peeling off those things that the board really has little influence over to get down to the number that we really begin to have influence over how the local dollars are spent. So I'm going to give him the clicker and let him start peeling off those things so that we see where the rubber meets the road.
All right. Thank you, Commissioner. So on the chart there, or the slide that you see here, you see basically the buildup on the left-hand side of the 1.55 billion. At the very top, you see something called special revenue funds. In our accounting system, there's different categories of funds, and special revenue funds, what that refers to are funding account strings that we use to account for revenue that comes in that is restricted in some means, either by law or by county policy, that we have to utilize those funds in a certain way. A couple good examples, we have our county transportation trust fund, which is primarily gas taxes, and statute defines how we can utilize those gas taxes. They all have to be used on roads, and so that's one of the examples. Another one would be the tourism tax fund, where we charge tourist tax, and those monies have to be used to bring people to Polk County so that they stay in our hotels, and we earn additional revenues from that.
Those are dollars that have some strings attached to it.
Yes,
Yep.
exactly.
So the latitude of the commission is restricted to what that source is. And that
Yes.
would be the one for the indigent health care would also include that,
Yes.
which is a big number.
Yep.
The absent sales tax approved 2 years ago by the citizens.
Yes.
So that peels off a bunch of money.
So that takes about 36% of the total budget, or about $562 million.
Wow.
So the next set that you see there in the light tan color are what we call enterprise funds. It's really, these are funds that work like business. They make revenue enough to cover their costs and keep providing services. So if you think about the three areas, one is our landfill. If you take trash to the landfill, you pay a certain rate, and then that's used to then continue to provide services and be able to operate the landfill. Another one is our Polk County Utilities, which provides water and wastewater services. And again, they receive money based on folks who are receiving those services paying a rate, and that money goes back in to continue providing those services.
Again, those revenues are proportionate to how much you use it.
Sure.
So if you use a lot of water, your water bill's high. If you take a lot of refuge or garbage to the landfill, then you pay accordingly. And the landfill is operated for the benefit of not only Polk County residents, but municipalities also. Some municipalities bring their waste stream to the county. So those are dollars that rotate in and out based on usage and are billed based on usage.
And in addition, when you're talking about the landfill, anybody can take their trash to the landfill. You can just throw something in the back of your truck and take it there and go across the scales and pay a certain fee. So it really is a countywide, service that's provided. So that's your enterprise funds. That takes another 29%, or about $460 million out of that total. We have a couple smaller areas coming up, but if you look, internal service funds. In government accounting, you have to track revenues as they come in, and then any transfers between funds also get counted as a revenue. So even though it's not new revenue, if you take money from one fund and transfer it to another fund, that counts as a revenue in our budget. Internal service funds, what those are funds that provide service to our other divisions and our other funds, and they receive a transfer of revenue from one of our other funds to pay for that service. So it's not new money, it's just really a transfer, it's an accounting transaction. Some examples are fleet maintenance, fleet replacement, information technology for computers, and our health insurance fund. So basically any division that has trucks and vehicles out on the roadways, those funds that pay for those trucks and vehicles pay into the fleet maintenance and the fleet replacement funds in order to continue getting maintenance and replacement of their vehicles.
So when a building inspector goes out to inspect a home or business under construction, the vehicle he travels in, as a little bit of that building permit cost includes that vehicle use that's paid back into the fund.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. That takes a little more. That's about $107, $108 million, or about 7% of the total budget. debt service, we have to establish funds to pay back loans, basically. So if we borrow money to do something, we've got to establish a fund to be able to then pay back that loan. And that's really what the debt service funds are. Those are solely to pay back debt that we have borrowed in the past. That's about 2% or about $31 million of our total
It's like
budget.
your mortgage payment.
Yeah.
Yeah, so those are obligated funds. They're going towards something that we've already done. They're paying back those loans, so we can't utilize those for anything else. Which then brings us to really the general fund, which is about 26% or $397 million of the total budget. And general fund is kind of like the name sounds. It's our fund that gets revenue that's not really restricted for any certain purpose. So what happens is a lot of our business units that don't have revenue, they're competing for what's left in the general fund basically to try to provide their service.
Now, what are some examples of services that come out of the general fund?
Sure. County probation is a good example. That's one of the services in the general fund. A lot of our central services, like human resources, the budget office is the general fund, communications. So a lot of our central services that provide general county administrative type sources. You also have code enforcement is in the general fund. Emergency medical services, which does have some revenue but isn't enough to fully cover it. So we have to pay for some of emergency medical services out of the general fund too.
Parks and Rec would be in there.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, Parks and Rec has their own fund. It's the Leisure Services MSU covers most of their costs, but Parks and Natural Resources themselves do have some of the general fund covers them also.
Okay.
So, yep.
All right, so now out of 1.55 billion, we're down to just under 400 million. 400 million is still a lot of money, but it ain't 1.55 billion.
No.
So then I'll continue if that's okay. But
Yeah,
then,
please.
then basically, if you think about general fund, there's also some things in the general fund that we have to keep in mind. So you're talking $397 million, just under 400 million. About half of that is used to cover the other elected officials, the sheriff, tax collector, property appraiser, supervisor of elections, and the clerk and comptroller.
Okay.
So we basically pay about $202 million out of our general fund to cover those agencies. And the largest of that, of course, is the sheriff. I think the sheriff's about 170 million of that 202. But again, we're required by statute to pay for portions or all of those elected officials' budgets, and so that's what that is. So that's spoken for. We also have mandates. So a good example of this is we're required to pay the medical expenses for inmates if they're taken out of the jail. So if an inmate has to be transported to hospital, we have to cover that cost. And so that's a big chunk of what those mandates are. And then also, so those are all basically mandated by statute or by law or some other purpose. And we get to reserves. Anybody that deals with money, you've got to have some kind of a reserve just to make sure we have money for an emergency, like we did this last year with Hurricane Irma. We've got to make sure we have money there to address things that aren't expected and that will keep our funds basically in good shape.
Yep.
And so that's the reserves. Our policy wants us to have about 16% or 60 days worth of reserves. We don't quite have that. We set that as a goal, but we aren't quite there. So our reserves are 10%. And then services with revenue. Some of our services, I mentioned one earlier, emergency medical services. The cost of emergency medical services is in the 26 to 30 million range. They get revenue from, if I had to call for an ambulance, I would have to pay a certain amount for that ambulance ride.
Right.
So they do get some revenues based on our charges for the service, but it's not enough to cover the full cost. So the total cost is 27 million, but we get about 20 million in revenue.
Okay.
So we still have a large amount there that we have to cover out of the general fund. The thing is, though, if we were to cut, and this is probably a bad example, you're not going to cut an emergency medical, but if you were to cut something like that had revenue, you'd also lose the revenue, so you're really not balancing your budget. So that's why we pull that out. Those services that have revenue, we pull back. That leaves us with basically 68.7 million now out of that $1.55 billion budget.
To run everything else.
Yeah, yep. And then go ahead.
So if you're going to cut something, it comes out of that tiny percentage that's left.
Yes,
Okay.
And then we get down to, even with that, there are certain things that are difficult to cut. And one of them, a really good example, is the one I mentioned earlier, county probation. If you were to cut county probation, you would actually end up paying more because you'd have more people in jail, and it costs more to house people in a jail than it does to have them on probation. So it just wouldn't make a lot of sense to look at cutting something like that. So there are these things that are very difficult to cut. In other areas, facilities. During the recession, facilities was one area that we cut back on, and it's very difficult to even think about doing any other cuts there, just because we have, I think it's around 4 million square feet of buildings in the county, and if we've got to be able to maintain those. If we put off maintenance on those, it costs more to fix it later. So those are just some examples of difficult to cut. That really brings us down to about 25.1 million, which is, as the commissioner said earlier, that's what's left to try and fund everything that's left. So.
Well, one thing we learned in this process, that you can't cover something as complex as a $1.55 billion budget in 15 minutes.
No.
So I'm going to be stealing time from one of my colleagues to wrap this up, but it is a very complex issue. I can tell you that every commissioner takes their role and responsibility very, very seriously. Some tough choices. There's some things I'd much rather do. As you know, this budget proposes that we increase taxes slightly for emergency medical services, and also to provide a fund to create a government service center on the east side of the county. So those are two immediate needs that when we get through all this math, there's simply not enough money remaining to cover those two vital elements. So, we looked hard, we bit the bullet, and decided that now's the time to take this step. Maybe on the next time around, we'll tour some of our fire service facilities. We've got some 25-plus-year-old mobile homes that we're asking firefighters and paramedics to reside in, some of which the physical fitness equipment they can't put in there because the floor won't support the weight of the equipment.
Wow.
But we didn't get in this situation overnight. We're not going to get out overnight. But there is a definitive plan to address the issues, to give these first responders the tools, the assets, and the housing they need and deserve to protect a growing population throughout Polk County.
Very good. Thank you, gentlemen, both of you. This is a complex issue, and you really took it in bite-sized pieces. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now it makes sense.
Thank you.
Don't go away. In our next segment, we'll be here with Commissioner John Hall along with Sheriff Grady Judd to talk about the new school guardian program. We'll be right back.
Last night in high school,
I tried Oxy at a couple of parties. I thought I had it under control. I didn't know it'd be this addictive. I didn't know how far I'd go to get more.
Opioid dependence can happen after just 5 days. Know the truth, spread the truth.
nobody likes an awkward silence, but you can actually use it for something good.
You haven't really been yourself lately. Are you okay?
Find out how you can help a friend with their mental health at seizetheawkward.org.
Listen, you're my friend.
I noticed you haven't really been yourself recently.
Yeah, I feel like something's up.
How are you?
Are you okay?
Is there anything you want to talk about?
I just want to know how you're feeling.
And listen, even if you don't know what to say, I'm here to talk.
No matter what you're going through,
I just want you to know I'm here.
I've got your back.
when you want to talk, I'm here.
I got some Oxy after I hurt my neck. I didn't know they'd be this addictive. I didn't know how far I'd go to get more.
Opioid dependence can happen after just 5 days. Know the truth, spread the truth.
Welcome back. Now we're going to talk about the School Guardian Program, which was Polk County's response to a tragedy in Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. With us are Commissioner John Hall and Sheriff Grady Judd.
How are you today?
Thank you. How are you?
Very well.
We'll jump right in if you don't mind. You put the call out to fill 90 positions at the 85 elementary schools in Polk County. Now 400 people applied, which is terrific. 400 people wanted to help, but not everybody who wants to help can help. So if you would, tell us a little bit about the testing and the training that people had to go through.
Only 16% of the people that applied passed. And here's what we found. When you give detailed backgrounds, psychologicals, drug screens, and then 144 hours of training in the summer heat where they have to shoot and show proficiency, you know that you have well-trained guardians. In fact, we requested and required that the guardians have even more training in the discipline of firearms than even a state-certified law enforcement officer has to have. And in addition to that, they have to qualify at 5 points higher than a certified law enforcement officer. So when you see a guardian on your school campus, you know that they've met the highest level of training and they've met the highest quality of person. And that's important because they're near our children and we want to make sure that they're capable of keeping our children safe, and they are.
Commissioner, have you had any phone calls from anyone, heard from any members of the public?
Actually, I have. Just this morning, I had a call from a lady whose son is 10 years old. He's in elementary school here and had nothing but the highest praise for the guardian that was put on that campus. That guardian interacts with the students. He knows the students by name, he gets to know them, and they get to know him. And nothing but the highest praise from that mother. But now I have some questions also, Sheriff, if you don't mind.
Sure.
You had mentioned the high proficiency in firearms training, and just kind of went over the psychological aspect of it. What are you looking for in someone that you're going to be putting in that type of situation, first of all, and then as far as the firearm training and all the other training that they had, was that just a one-time deal, or like your deputies, do they have to come back and qualify every year?
Sure. You know, what's important to remember is that the training and the responsibility for the guardians is not less than for a law enforcement officer. Really, it's more. They have to do quarterly training, and they have to qualify on the range twice a year. But what's really interesting about that is I had a principal stop me the other night and say, "You have no idea how much we appreciate the guardians." And you know what's exciting about that? What's exciting to me is we heard all over the state and all over the nation, we don't want more guns in our schools, and quite frankly, the teachers' unions across the state pushed back really hard. The people we were trying to protect the most are our children, and the teachers were pushing back in the form of the unions. But what we found was really happening was the teachers and the principals and the administrators were really very supportive. Jackie Bird, our superintendent, which I think is awesome, was supportive, as well as our entire school board. We had a 7-0 vote in favor of the guardians. And you know what? They're a hit on every campus. So we're looking for people that want to protect children and love children and will risk their own life in order to protect children. If they won't run into gunfire to protect a child, then we can't use them.
I think some of the pushback are people who weren't as well informed and didn't realize the kind of commitment that you were asking for.
Oh, you're exactly correct. But what really was frustrating during the legislative process is not only were they not well informed, they didn't want to be. They didn't even give us time to explain the program before they were saying no, no, no. And I was okay with no, no, no if they could give me a better alternative. But you know what? There were 0 better alternatives. And when I was there lobbying for this bill to be passed, and I certainly applaud Governor Scott and the Speaker of the House, Corcoran, and our President of the Senate for leading the charge. When I was there lobbying, what I told them that I was hearing at home was, listen, nothing in this world is more important than our children. And yes, we have to have layers and layers and layers of prevention and intervention because we really don't want to find the active assailant when they're walking onto the campus. We want to discover them far in advance and do something about it then. But when all that fails, and the active assailant is walking down the hallway toward your child's classroom to slaughter your child and all of his and her colleagues, what do you want us to do? Well, the support that we got here at home in Polk County was, Sheriff, we want somebody well-trained and well-armed to protect our students. And that's what we give the community. Our guarantee is we'll lay our life down to protect your child.
Commissioner, any additional thoughts?
Oh, sure. Sheriff, we saved a lot of money by going to guardians instead of using deputies on your staff. Exactly how much is that? Do you know that?
Well, the police chiefs and I worked together because here's what we knew. If we had the $16 million new dollars that it would have cost to put a guardian on every school campus and every charter school campus, we don't have the deputies. We don't have the police officers. There's a shortage of law enforcement officers across this state and across this nation now. So even if we'd had an extra $16 million laying around, we could not have filled the positions, and we certainly couldn't have gotten everyone trained by 13 August when school started. But here's what happened. We were able to fill every charter school and every public school for about $800,000, $900,000. That included their training and their equipment. And the school board chose to add $3 million in labor cost. The charter schools are using existing personnel. So we did totally at the county, the sheriff's office in the county, $800,000, what otherwise would have cost $16 million. And if you look at the county school cost, they had $3 million. So if you add it together, we saved the taxpayers the difference between 16.8 and 3.8. What's that, about a $12 million savings?
Wow.
I think that's a big deal.
Yeah.
Sure, sure. Now, in your response to that question, you said you'd put guardians or, in some cases, your resource officers on every campus in the county. So now everyone has either a resource officer or a guardian on campus?
That's correct, in the cities and in the counties. You know, I've got to brag a lot on the police chiefs. They're dear friends of mine, they're very professional, but we all worked on this together. And it was our goal, with us working together with the county, with the school board, to say there's nothing more important in the entire world than our children. And every public school and every charter school in this county has either a school resource officer, a school resource deputy, or a guardian. And the children are safer this year than they were even last year. And last year it was pretty safe because we'd already implemented a lot of safety measures on the campuses, but the children are even safer this year.
Well, thank you, Sheriff Judd, and thank you, Commissioner Hall, for doing what you do to keep our children safe.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of the Commissioner's Report.